The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was not simply a tragic accident. It was the public exposure of a workplace system that had made escape difficult before the first flame appeared. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Before anyone saw smoke, before the alarm reached fire stations, before crowds gathered in Greenwich Village, the danger was already built into the ordinary working day. It was in the crowded workrooms. It was in the long tables and bulky machines. It was in the cotton fabric, paper waste, scraps, lint, thread, and dust that filled the factory. It was in the locked and blocked routes of escape. It was in a building whose upper floors rose beyond the reach of the ladders available to firefighters on the street below. Then, on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, all of those conditions met a flame. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Asch Building at 23 to 29 Washington Place, just east of Washington Square Park in Manhattan. It was not an isolated rural mill, hidden from public view. It stood in Greenwich Village, in one of the most visible cities in the world, near streets filled with students, residents, workers, reformers, and passers-by. The factory made women's shirtwaists, a fashionable and practical blouse popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The garment belonged to a modern urban world, mass production, ready-to-wear clothing, women entering public life and wage work, and a consumer market hungry for affordable style. But the same factory that produced this modern garment exposed its workers to old and lethal risks. The New York State Department of Labor states that the fire lasted only about half an hour. Cornell's Kiel Center timeline records that a call to fire stations went out at 4:45 in the afternoon. Within that brief span, the Triangle Fire killed 146 workers. Many were young immigrant women from Jewish and Italian immigrant communities. Britannica reports that the dead included 129 women and 17 men. A half hour is a terrible measure for a disaster of this scale. It is shorter than a lunch break, shorter than a walk across much of lower Manhattan, shorter than the time it takes to finish a shift's final tasks and begin going home. Yet in that compressed time, a factory became a death trap, a city became a witness, and an industrial tragedy became a turning point in American labor history. The fire began on the 8th floor and spread rapidly upward through the Triangle workrooms. The materials that fed it were not unusual. They were the ordinary materials of garment production: cotton fabric, paper waste, fabric scraps, lint, thread, dust. These were the remains and tools of daily work. They accumulated where cutting, sewing, finishing, and packing happened at speed. In another setting, they might have seemed like clutter. In the Triangle factory, once fire took hold, they became fuel. That is one reason the disaster cannot be understood only as a sudden emergency. It was also a revelation of what had been normalized. A workplace can look modern and still be unsafe. A factory can stand in a substantial building and still leave its workers with fragile protection. A business can produce a garment associated with mobility and independence while constraining the movement of the people who make it. The contradiction is sharp. The shirtwaist itself was part of a changing world. The Smithsonian has noted that shirtwaists were practical for working-class women because they were easier to clean and allowed greater freedom of movement than a full dress. They fit the lives of women who worked, traveled, and moved through the city. Yet inside the Triangle Waste Company, many of the workers who made these blouses faced a workplace where movement could be controlled, narrowed, or blocked at the very moment when movement meant survival. When the fire spread, escape failed in multiple ways. Workers were trapped by locked exits, doors that opened the wrong way or inward, crowded rooms, long tables, bulky machinery, and jammed routes out. The building had only one fire escape, according to OSHA, and that fire escape collapsed during the rescue effort. Firefighters came, but their ladders were too short to reach the top factory floors. Cornell's timeline states that they did not reach above the 6th floor. The factory was on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. That vertical fact matters. The Triangle workers were not merely inside a burning room. Many were above the practical reach of rescue from below. The height of the building, the layout of the workplace, the limits of firefighting equipment, and the failures of exits combined into a single catastrophe. No one detail explains everything. The fire's deadliness came from a chain of conditions, each one making the next more unforgiving. In the days and months that followed, the public would ask what had happened inside the Asch Building. How had a fire moved so quickly through a factory in the center of New York City? Why had workers been unable to get out? Why were exits locked or unusable? Why was there only one fire escape? And why did it fail? Why could firefighters reach only so high? And above all, why had such dangers been permitted to become ordinary parts of industrial life? Those questions did not arise in a vacuum. The garment industry had already been a place of conflict. Shirtwaist workers in New York City had already challenged wages, hours, and shop conditions in the uprising of the 20,000. Labor organizations and reform networks, including the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Women's Trade Union League, were already part of the city's political and industrial landscape. Figures such as Clara Lemlich, Rose Schneiderman, Pauline Newman, and Frances Perkins would help give language, organization, and force to the outrage that followed. But on the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, before hearings, investigations, trials, or legislation, the first force was grief. The grief was public because the disaster was public. New Yorkers saw the smoke, the flames, the bodies, the limits of rescue. Families searched for daughters, sisters, sons, and friends. The victims were not abstractions in a report. They were workers whose lives had been tied to the city's immigrant neighborhoods, its factories, its clothing trade, and its promise of opportunity. The sight of their deaths made it harder to treat factory safety as a technical issue or a private matter between employer and employee. That visibility helped change the political meaning of the fire. A workplace disaster became a civic accusation. It asked whether a city that depended on industrial labor had accepted too much danger as the price of production. It asked whether the law had kept pace with the factory. It asked whether enforcement had been strong enough, whether buildings had been inspected closely enough, whether the lives of immigrant workers had been valued highly enough before catastrophe made them impossible to ignore. The answers would unfold through investigation and reform. The New York State Factory Investigating Commission would be created in 1911 as a reaction to the Triangle Fire. It would study fire hazards, sanitary conditions, occupational disease, factory inspection, tenement manufacturing, and other workplace issues. Its work would help turn mourning into a research-driven reform program. Several commission-recommended bills passed in 1912, including measures concerning factory registration, automatic sprinklers, and other fire safety and health regulations. Cornell has described the fire as widely considered a pivotal event that transformed New York State's labor code and produced fire safety measures that served as a national model. But those changes came later. To understand why they mattered, we first have to stay with the half hour itself and with the place where it happened. The Asch Building was a modern urban factory building, completed in 1901. It would later be known as the Brown Building, part of New York University, and would become a landmarked site of memory. But on that Saturday afternoon, its upper floors held the Triangle Waste Company, about 500 workers, and the conditions that turned a fast-moving fire into one of the defining labor disasters in American history. The story now narrows to that building, its address, its height, its floors above Washington Place, and the dangerous gap between architectural permanence and human safety. To stay with the place where it happened is to see the disaster differently. The Triangle Fire was not only an event in time, measured in minutes. It was also an event in space, in stairways, doorways, workrooms, windows, and floors high above the street. The address was 23 to 29 Washington Place, in Greenwich Village, just east of Washington Square Park. Today, the building belongs to a different cityscape. It is known as the Brown Building, part of New York University, surrounded by the movement of students, faculty, tourists, and neighborhood life. But in 1911, it was the Asch Building, and its upper floors housed one of the most consequential workplaces in American labor history. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. That fact is often stated quickly as a location detail, but it deserves to be held for a moment. The factory was not at street level. It was not a low workshop with doors opening directly onto a sidewalk. It sat near the top of a 10-story building, above Washington Place, above the reach of easy escape, above the level where ordinary rescue equipment could reliably make contact with the windows. The building itself had been completed in 1901. It was, by the standards of its time, a modern urban factory building. The National Park Service describes its architectural style as neo-Renaissance, with a stone base, brick upper walls, terracotta trim, and limestone pilasters. These details matter because they remind us that the Triangle disaster did not happen in a structure that looked temporary or ruined. It happened inside a building with a formal, public face, a building meant to stand, to project order, investment, and modernity. There is a difficult contradiction here. The architecture could appear permanent, but the safety of the people inside was fragile. The walls endured. The stone, brick, terracotta, and limestone remained. The building would survive the fire, change names, become part of a university, and eventually become a protected landmark. But on the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, the people working on its upper floors had only the safety systems, exits, and rescue possibilities available to them in that moment. The permanence of the building did not translate into protection for the workers. That gap between appearance and safety is one of the central meanings of the Asch Building. It was not hidden in a remote industrial district. It stood near Washington Square Park, in one of the most recognizable parts of Manhattan. Its location placed the factory within the visible life of the city. People could look up at its windows from the street. Workers could look down from the upper floors onto Washington Place and the surrounding neighborhood. The building belonged to a dense urban environment where manufacturing, commerce, reform politics, immigrant life, and public spectatorship could all exist within blocks of one another. Inside, the Triangle Waist Company used the upper floors for mass garment production. The 8th, 9th, and 10th floors were not incidental storage rooms or small offices. They were the working levels of a large factory, employing about 500 people. The work depended on speed, organization, and concentration. People, machines, tables, fabric, paper, thread, scraps, lint, and dust brought together in a compact industrial space. Later chapters will follow those materials and movements more closely. For now, the important point is that the building concentrated this labor high above the street. Height shaped everything that happened afterward. It shaped how workers tried to leave. It shaped what routes mattered. It shaped how much time stairways, elevators, doors, and windows could give or take away. It shaped the limits faced by firefighters arriving from below. A factory on the upper floors of a 10-story building depended on systems of vertical movement. Stairs had to work. Doors had to open. Elevators had to be usable. Fire escapes had to hold. Rescue equipment had to reach. If any part of that chain failed, height turned from an architectural feature into a trap. The Asch Building's later identity makes the contrast even sharper. The same structure that held the Triangle Waist Company later became the Brown Building. It became part of New York University, absorbed into an institution associated with education, research, and public memory. The building was added to the National Register of Historic Places and designated a National Historic Landmark on July 17, 1991. It was designated a New York City landmark on March 25, 2003. Those later recognitions did not undo what happened there. They did something different. They marked the site as a place where the physical city and the moral history of labor met. Landmark status can preserve walls, facades, and addresses, but it also asks the public to remember why a building matters. In the case of the Brown Building, the significance is inseparable from the workers who climbed to the upper floors, entered the Triangle shop, and became part of a workplace system whose dangers were exposed in the most devastating way. It is tempting, when looking back from the present, to let the building's survival soften the story. The structure remains. The address can still be found. The street still runs past it. Washington Square Park is still nearby. But the survival of the building is precisely what makes the history so unsettling. The city kept the shell. The people inside were far more vulnerable than the architecture around them. That vulnerability was not only a matter of fire. It was a matter of design, management, regulation, and assumptions about whose safety counted. The workers on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors occupied a modern industrial space, but modernity itself did not guarantee humane conditions. A building could be new for its time and still lack adequate protection. A factory could be efficient and still be deadly. A workplace could produce fashionable goods for a changing consumer world, while exposing the people who made those goods to risks hidden from the customer's view. The Asch Building helps us see that the Triangle Fire was not a contradiction between progress and backwardness in any simple sense. It was a contradiction inside progress. Early 20th century New York had the capacity to build upward, to concentrate production, to organize large numbers of workers, and to supply a growing market for ready-to-wear clothing. But the systems meant to protect workers had not kept pace with the industrial city's height, density, and speed. At street level, the building presented itself as part of the city's built confidence. Above, workers moved through the routines of factory life. The distance between those two realities was not only vertical, it was political and social. The people who made garments in the upper rooms were often far removed from the people who bought them, regulated them, or profited from them. The building joined those worlds physically, but not equally. This is why the location matters so much. 23 to 29 Washington Place was not merely an address attached to a tragedy. It was the setting that made the tragedy take the shape it did. The upper floors created dependence on escape routes. The urban height exposed the limits of rescue. The building's strength outlasted the workers' safety. And its later landmark status turned a commercial structure into a permanent witness. Today, when the Brown Building is named in histories, plaques, and memorials, it carries more than one identity. It is an academic building, a landmark, and the former Asch Building. It is also the place where the Triangle Waste Company's workrooms became a national lesson in the consequences of neglect. The stone and brick remained, but the meaning of the building changed because of what happened within it. To understand the factory inside those walls, we have to move from the building itself to the work it contained. The Triangle Waist Company was named for the garment it produced, the shirtwaist, a blouse that became closely tied to women's changing lives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The building tells us where the workers were. The garment begins to tell us why they were there, what they made, and how a popular article of clothing connected the upper floors of Washington Place to the wider world of labor, fashion, and immigrant New York. Inside the walls of the Asch Building, the work had a name that sounded almost ordinary: waists. The Triangle Waist Company made women's shirtwaists, a type of blouse that became one of the defining garments of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To understand why hundreds of workers were gathered on the upper floors of Washington Place, it helps to pause over that garment. It was not just an item in a shop window. It was part of a larger change in women's daily lives, and part of the industrial system that made fashion available at a scale earlier generations had not known. A shirtwaist was, in simple terms, a blouse. It could be worn with a separate skirt, which made it different from a full dress. That separation mattered. The Smithsonian has noted that shirtwaists were practical for working-class women because they were easier to clean and allowed more freedom of movement than a full dress. In those two details, cleaning and movement, the garment opens onto a wider history. It belonged to a world in which many women were moving through public space in new ways, going to work, traveling through the city, managing household labor, and participating in a modern urban life that demanded clothing that could be washed, changed, and worn with less restriction. The shirtwaist looked respectable enough for office work, shops, classrooms, and the street, but it was also useful. It did not require the same care as a more elaborate dress. It could be paired with a skirt and replaced or laundered separately. For working women, that was not a minor convenience. Clothing had to survive long days, crowded streets, and the physical demands of labor. A practical blouse could be part of a wardrobe that was modest, flexible, and more manageable for women who did not have servants or leisure time to maintain delicate garments. That practicality helped make the shirtwaist popular. Popularity, in turn, made it profitable. And profitability drew the garment into the new systems of mass production. The Triangle Waist Company was one of the firms that met this demand. On the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Asch Building, workers cut, stitched, finished, and handled the materials that turned fabric into a fashionable article of women's clothing. The company's product was tied to ideas of modernity and independence. But the way that product was made depended on a dense, disciplined, and often vulnerable workforce. This is one of the central contradictions of the Triangle story. The shirtwaist suggested movement. It gave women more freedom than a full dress. It belonged to a changing city, a changing marketplace, and a changing idea of women's place in public life. Yet, many of the women who made it spent their days under strict industrial conditions, high above the street, in crowded workrooms organized around speed, output, and control. The garment that helped some women move more easily through the world was produced by other women whose own movement inside the factory could be limited in ways that would later prove deadly. The Triangle workforce numbered about 500 people. Many were young immigrant women. Many came from Jewish and Italian immigrant communities, part of the broader garment workforce that shaped New York City in the early 20th century. Their labor connected the factory to neighborhoods, families, languages, and migration histories beyond Washington Place. They were not anonymous parts of a machine, even when the work system treated them as replaceable. They were daughters, sisters, wage earners, and newcomers, helping support households and building lives in a city that offered both opportunity and danger. The immigrant character of the workforce matters because the garment industry was one of the places where newcomers to the United States found work. It was also a place where exploitation could hide in plain sight. Young women, especially immigrant women, often had limited power against employers. They might need wages urgently. They might have family responsibilities. They might face language barriers, prejudice, or a labor market that gave them few choices. In that setting, the shirtwaist industry offered employment, but it also exposed workers to low pay, long hours, close supervision, and unsafe conditions. The Triangle Waist Company stood at the meeting point of consumer desire and immigrant labor. A woman buying a shirtwaist might see fashion, practicality, or respectability. A factory owner might see demand, orders, and profit. A worker at a machine might see the pace of the day, pieces to finish, seams to complete, supervisors watching, wages tied to production, and the pressure to keep up. The same garment carried different meanings depending on where one stood in the chain that produced it. The work itself was built around materials that seemed ordinary: cotton fabric, thread, paper, scraps, lint, dust. These were the ingredients of everyday garment production. They filled workrooms because they had to. Cloth had to be cut. Thread had to be used. Scraps collected as pieces were shaped and assembled. In later chapters, those same materials will become important for a more terrible reason. But before they were fuel, they were the residue of routine labor. They were part of the normal atmosphere of a factory producing large quantities of clothing for a growing market. It is important not to let the later disaster flatten the workers' lives into a single moment of death. Before the fire, the Triangle workers had ordinary working days, difficult working days, and lives outside the building. They entered the factory not as symbols, but as people earning wages in one of the major industries of the city. Some were teenagers or young adults. Many were women at an age when work, family duty, and hopes for independence overlapped. The fact that so many were young immigrant women would later intensify public grief. But even before the city mourned them, their presence in the factory reflected a larger reality. Modern American industry was being built not only by machines and capital, but by the hands of workers who had recently arrived or whose families had recently arrived from elsewhere. The owners of Triangle, Isaac Harris and Max Blanck, ran a business that produced a garment in demand. Their factory was not a small back room hidden from view. It occupied upper floors in a modern industrial building near Washington Square. That fact makes the story more unsettling, not less. The danger was not confined to the most visibly old or decaying workplaces. It could exist inside a building that looked permanent and up-to-date, in an industry supplying modern fashion to modern consumers. The shirtwaist also helps explain why the Triangle Fire became more than a local tragedy. The disaster struck at a garment almost everyone could understand. It was not an obscure industrial product. It was clothing, something intimate and familiar, something worn on the body. The blouse connected the factory to women across class lines, though not equally. A middle-class woman might wear a shirtwaist as part of a respectable public appearance. A working-class woman might wear one because it was practical and easier to clean. The workers at Triangle made that garment in large quantities, under conditions that many consumers never saw. By following the shirtwaist, the story moves from architecture to labor. The Asch Building tells us where the workers were placed: high floors, stairways, doors, windows, and crowded rooms above the street. The shirtwaist tells us why they were assembled there: to meet the demand for a fashionable, practical blouse through speed and mass production. And the workers tell us what that system required: Hundreds of people, many of them young immigrant women from Jewish and Italian communities, whose labor made the garment affordable and available. Their presence also points toward a tension that was already building before the fire. The Triangle disaster did not occur in a silent world where no one had questioned factory conditions. Shirtwaist workers in New York City had already organized, protested, and demanded change. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Women's Trade Union League, and figures such as Clara Lemlich, Rose Schneiderman, and Pauline Newman belonged to a reform and labor landscape that was taking shape before the smoke rose over Washington Place. The blouse was fashionable, but the industry behind it was contested. Long before the fire forced the city to look upward toward the Asch Building, workers had been insisting that the conditions inside those factories were matters of public concern. The workers who made shirtwaists were not only part of an industry, they were part of a struggle already underway. Before the fire, before Washington Place became a site of mourning, garment workers in New York City had been naming the pressures inside their shops: long hours, low wages, crowded rooms, and the daily power of employers over the movement and safety of the people at the machines. This is what makes the Triangle Fire more than a sudden accident in an otherwise unnoticed workplace. The disaster struck an industry that was already contested. It came after years in which workers, unions, and reformers had begun to build the language and the organizations that could turn private suffering into public argument. At the center of that pre-fire world was the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, often known as the ILGWU. It represented a growing effort to organize workers in the garment trades, including the young immigrant women who filled the shirtwaist shops of New York. The union's very name tells us something important about the period. Women were central to the labor force in this industry, but the structures of power around them were not built to protect them. If they wanted better conditions, they often had to create pressure from below. That pressure became visible in the shirtwaist strike of 1909, remembered as the uprising of the 20,000. It was one of the defining labor actions in New York's garment industry before the Triangle Fire. Shirtwaist workers walked out in protest, challenging the conditions under which fashionable blouses were being made. The strike did not occur in the abstract. It belonged to the same city, the same industry, and the same kind of shops that would later be scrutinized after the Triangle disaster. Among the figures associated with this world was Clara Lemlich. She became one of the best-known voices of the uprising, a young garment worker whose name came to stand for the courage of women workers refusing to remain quiet. Her importance was not only symbolic. She represented the reality that many of the people most directly affected by factory conditions were themselves the people demanding change. The call for reform did not begin in a committee room. It began in workrooms, on picket lines, and among workers who understood the pressures of the job because they lived them. The Women's Trade Union League also mattered deeply in this landscape. Often abbreviated WTUL, the organization connected working women with middle-class and upper-class reformers who supported labor organizing and protective legislation. That alliance could be uneasy, shaped by differences of class, language, and experience. But it created networks that would prove important. It helped make the conditions of women's industrial labor visible to people with political access, social standing, and public influence. In the history of the Triangle Fire, these networks are essential because outrage alone does not automatically become law. Grief can fill streets. Newspaper accounts can shock readers. Public meetings can draw crowds. But turning anger into enforceable rules requires organization, testimony, political pressure, and people prepared to keep pushing after the first wave of horror has passed. The labor and reform circles that existed before the fire helped make that possible. Rose Schneiderman was one of the figures who connected those worlds. A labor organizer and reform advocate, she was part of the wider movement that insisted factory conditions were not simply private arrangements between employer and employee. They were public matters. They affected families, neighborhoods, and the moral life of the city. Schneiderman's role belonged to a broader argument that the people who produced the goods of modern urban life should not be treated as disposable within the machinery of production. Pauline Newman also stood within this garment labor reform world. Like Lemlich and Schneiderman, she is tied to the history of workers and organizers who challenged the conditions faced by women in the industry. These names matter because they prevent the story from becoming only a story of victims after the fact. Before the fire, there were already leaders, organizers, and witnesses to industrial hardship. There were already women who could speak about garment work not as an image seen from the street, but as a lived reality at the bench, the machine, and the crowded shop floor. The Triangle Waist Company itself was part of this larger shirtwaist world. Its owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blanck, ran a business that produced a popular garment for a growing market. The shirtwaist had become a practical and fashionable article of clothing, connected to changing women's lives. But in the factories that made it, the demand for speed and output pressed heavily on workers. The industry's success depended on dense organization, many people, many machines, piles of cloth, and rapid work. Labor unrest grew from that pressure. The uprising of the 20,000 showed that workers understood the stakes before the public tragedy forced others to confront them. They were not waiting for disaster to discover that factory life could be dangerous or unjust. They had already raised questions about wages, hours, treatment, and shop conditions. The strike made the garment industry a matter of public debate in New York City. It also helped strengthen relationships among unions, reformers, and supporters who would later respond to the fire with more than sorrow. Frances Perkins belongs to the next part of that arc, but her presence is important here because she represents the bridge between witnessing, reform, and political power. Perkins would witness the Triangle Fire and later become New York State Industrial Commissioner. In 1933, she became United States Secretary of Labor, the first woman to serve in a federal cabinet position. Her later career shows how the memory of the fire traveled beyond one city block. It entered the machinery of labor policy, inspection, and national reform. But Perkins did not emerge into an empty field. By the time the Triangle Fire occurred on March 25, 1911, there were already organizations prepared to interpret what had happened. The ILGWU could speak from the standpoint of garment workers. The Women's Trade Union League could help connect workers' demands to broader reform campaigns. Organizers such as Clara Lemlich, Rose Schneiderman, and Pauline Newman had already helped define the garment industry as a place where women's labor, immigrant labor, and public responsibility came together. This matters because the fire would later be remembered as a turning point, but turning points are rarely born from a single moment alone. They depend on pressure already gathered beneath the surface. They depend on arguments that have been made before, even if ignored. They depend on networks of people who know where to direct public attention when catastrophe exposes what routine life had concealed. The Triangle disaster did not create the garment labor movement. It intensified the urgency around demands that workers and reformers had already been making. It gave those demands a terrible evidence. After the fire, the question would no longer be whether factory conditions were merely internal business matters. The dead on Washington Place would make that argument impossible to sustain with the same ease. Still, before the smoke, before the alarms, before the crowds gathered below the Asch Building, the daily conditions of mass production garment work had already shaped the struggle. The same industry that brought workers together in large numbers also brought together the materials of production: cotton fabric, paper waste, scraps, lint, thread, and dust. Reformers could name the social danger. Workers could describe the pressure and confinement. But inside the workrooms, the physical danger was waiting in ordinary form, mixed into the fabric of the job itself. The danger inside the Triangle workrooms did not arrive as something unusual. It was not stored apart from the work, marked off as a special threat, or separated from the daily routine. It was woven into the ordinary materials of shirtwaist production. Cotton fabric, paper, scraps, thread, lint, and dust were not incidental to the business. They were the business, or the residue left behind by it. In a factory built for speed, these materials moved through the room constantly, from cutting tables to sewing machines, from bundles of cloth to finished wastes. By the time the fire began, on the 8th floor, the fuel was already everywhere. That is one of the hardest truths of the Triangle disaster. The workrooms were not dangerous only because something went wrong that afternoon. They were dangerous because the normal conditions of mass production garment work had created an environment in which flame could travel with terrifying ease. The same process that made a fashionable blouse affordable and available also filled the upper floors of the Asch Building with lightweight cloth, waste paper, loose scraps, thread, and fine particles that could catch and carry fire. The Triangle Waist Company made women's shirtwaists in large quantities. That meant fabric arrived in bulk, was cut in stacks, sorted, handled, sewn, trimmed, and prepared for sale. Each step produced waste. A clean finished garment depended on a messy industrial process. Patterns had to be cut from cloth. Edges had to be trimmed. Paper was used and discarded. Thread broke, collected, and fell. Lint gathered. Dust settled. The remnants of production accumulated around the very machinery and tables that made production possible. In another setting, a scrap of cotton or a little paper waste might seem harmless. In a crowded workroom, multiplied across an entire floor of a busy factory, those same materials became a continuous field of fuel. The risk was not only the presence of one flammable object. It was the density of many small flammable things spread through a workplace where people labored close together and where routes of movement were already constrained by tables, machines, and the pressure of work. The fire started on the 8th floor. From there, it spread rapidly upward through the Triangle workrooms. The mechanism was brutally simple. A flame found materials ready to burn. Cotton fabric burns. Paper waste burns. Fabric scraps burn. Lint, thread, and dust can help flame move and multiply. These were not rare substances. They were the ordinary surroundings of the people who worked there. The factory's danger was not hidden in a distant boiler room or an isolated storage closet. It lay across tables, beneath benches, in corners, around machines, and in the air of production itself. This matters because disasters are often remembered through a single dramatic image: the alarm, the smoke, the blocked door, the fire escape, the ladders that could not reach. Those failures were real, and they would shape the loss of life. But before escape became impossible, the fire had to become large enough, fast enough, and frightening enough to overwhelm the workers' ability to respond. The materials in the workrooms helped make that possible. They transformed a workplace into a path for fire. The Triangle factory occupied the upper floors of a modern urban building, not a remote wooden shed. The Asch Building stood in Greenwich Village, just east of Washington Square Park, part of a city that saw itself as modern, commercial, and forward-looking. Yet modernity did not remove the danger. It could concentrate it. The upper floor factory gathered hundreds of workers and the materials of garment production into a vertical space high above the street. The height of the building made rescue more difficult. The layout of production made movement more difficult. But inside the room, before any worker reached a stairway or door, the fuel of the fire was already shaping what would happen. The garment industry depended on speed and repetition. A shirtwaist passed through many hands, each worker doing a part of the larger process. That system could produce volume, but it also meant the room was organized around output. Tables, machines, fabric, and workers had to be close enough for the process to keep moving. In such a setting, ordinary housekeeping was not a minor issue. Waste was not merely untidy. Accumulated scraps, paper, lint, and dust changed the fire conditions of the room. The sources described the fire as beginning on the 8th floor and spreading through workrooms filled with cotton fabric, paper waste, scraps, lint, and other flammable materials. That phrase, flammable materials, can sound technical, almost neutral. But in this case, it names the physical world of the worker's day. The danger was not separate from labor. It was the cloth they handled, the fragments that fell from it, the paper that surrounded it, the thread that stitched it, and the dust left behind by constant cutting and sewing. For the workers, these materials would have been familiar. They would have known the sight of cloth piled for work, the feel of thread, the presence of scraps near the tables. They were not signs of emergency. They were signs that the shop was operating. A room full of fabric meant orders, wages, discipline, deadlines, and the ordinary pressure of a working day. That is why the fire's fuel is so important to understand. Catastrophe did not require a strange or exotic substance. It required the normal materials of the trade, gathered in a place without sufficient protection against what those materials could become. The fire also exposed a wider problem in the way industrial risk was understood. Employers, inspectors, workers, and reformers could all see a crowded shop. They could see cloth and paper. They could see the evidence of speed. But what seemed ordinary could be treated as acceptable simply because it was common. In the garment industry, fabric scraps and lint were part of the work. Their presence may not have felt exceptional until the moment flame moved through them. The Triangle disaster forced the city to recognize that common conditions could be deadly conditions. The movement of the fire upward is also important. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Once fire took hold on the 8th floor, the danger was not limited to the place where it began. In a high-rise factory, floors were connected by stairs, shafts, openings, and the basic organization of the workplace. Smoke and flame did not need much time to turn a localized fire into a building-wide emergency for the people above and around it. The very arrangement of the company across the upper floors meant that a fire beginning below could threaten workers who had only moments to understand what was happening. The speed of the disaster would later become one of its defining facts. The New York State Department of Labor states that the fire lasted only about half an hour. That brief span is almost impossible to reconcile with the scale of the loss. But the fuel inside the workrooms helps explain how so much could happen so quickly. When combustible materials are spread through a crowded industrial space, time contracts. A small flame can become a wall of heat and smoke. A familiar room can become unrecognizable. Decisions that might take minutes in ordinary life have to be made in seconds. And in those seconds, workers faced more than fire. They faced the environment that the factory had built around them: long tables, bulky machinery, crowded workrooms, and routes of escape that could jam or fail. Those issues belong to the next stage of the story, but they cannot be separated from the fire's fuel. A slow fire in an open room is one kind of emergency. A fast-moving fire in a crowded garment factory high above the street is another. The materials fed the flames, and the shape of the workplace limited the human response. This is where the Triangle Fire becomes more than an account of combustion. It becomes a study of how everyday industrial arrangements can produce extraordinary vulnerability. Cotton fabric was valuable when it could be turned into shirtwaists. Paper helped organize and move production. Thread held the garments together. Scraps and lint were the leftovers of efficiency. Yet together, under the wrong conditions, they became the substance of disaster. The workers who entered the Triangle factory that Saturday were entering a space built around production, not emergency. The materials around them had been placed there for work, not for destruction. That is what gives this chapter of the story its quiet force. The fire did not need to search for fuel. The fuel had been assembled by the ordinary routines of the shop. By late afternoon, the conditions were in place. The upper floors of the Asch Building, the Triangle workrooms, the crowded arrangements of garment production, and the combustible residue of a busy industry. Then came the moment when ordinary materials crossed into catastrophe. A fire began on the 8th floor, and within minutes, the daily world of cotton, paper, scraps, lint, thread, and dust became something else entirely. The clock was moving toward 4:45 in the afternoon, when the alarm would go out and the city would begin to understand that the danger high above Washington Place was already racing beyond control. By late afternoon, the conditions inside the Triangle workrooms had already been made ordinary by repetition. Fabric lay where fabric was needed. Scraps collected where cutting and sewing produced them. Lint, thread, dust, and paper waste belonged to the rhythm of production. The danger was not separate from the workday. It was part of the workday's material world. Then, on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, that material world changed in a matter of minutes. Cornell's Kiel Center timeline places one of the decisive public moments at 4:45 in the afternoon when a call went out to fire stations. By then, the emergency inside the Asch Building was no longer a private problem of one shop floor. It had become a city emergency, carried by alarm from Washington Place into the fire department's system of response. That time matters because it gives the disaster a shape. The Triangle Fire is often remembered through its consequences: the deaths, the grief, the trials, the investigations, the laws. But before all of that, there was a very short interval in which a working factory became a burning trap. The New York State Department of Labor describes the fire as lasting only about half an hour. Half an hour is long enough for a city to change. It is also brief enough to show how little time the workers had once the conditions around them ignited. The fire began on the 8th floor of the Asch Building, inside the Triangle Waste Company's factory. The company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building at 23 to 29 Washington Place, just east of Washington Square Park. The location was urban, visible, and close to the life of Greenwich Village. But the first moments of the fire took place above the street, inside the upper floors where the work of shirtwaist production was concentrated. The documented mechanisms of the fire are plain and terrible. The workrooms contained cotton fabric, paper waste, fabric scraps, lint, thread, dust, and other flammable materials. These were not exotic substances. They were the basic materials and residues of garment manufacturing. A shirtwaist factory produced garments, but it also produced loose scraps, floating fibers, discarded paper, and accumulations of combustible waste. In a crowded room, among tables and machines and workers, those materials could carry fire with frightening speed. The fire did not have to move through empty space. It moved through a workplace arranged for mass production. The factory was crowded. Work tables, sewing machines, workers, unfinished garments, and waste all shared the same industrial floor. That crowding mattered because fire is not only a chemical event, it is also a spatial one. What burns, how closely it is packed, how people can move, and how quickly heat and smoke reach the next material all shape the course of a disaster. On the 8th floor, the first danger was immediate flame. But the Triangle factory was not limited to one floor. Its operations extended upward. Once the fire began, it spread rapidly through the Triangle workrooms. The movement upward is one of the essential facts of the disaster. The company's floors were stacked near the top of a 10-story building, and the hazard was stacked with them. Combustible materials, dense workrooms, and workers whose routes out would soon be tested under conditions of panic and heat. In ordinary time, the separation between floors could make the factory seem organized. One floor above another, each part of the business occupying its place in the building. In fire time, that same vertical arrangement became dangerous. A blaze that began on the 8th floor threatened not only the workers nearest its origin, but also those above on the 9th and 10th floors. The factory's height, which had earlier been part of its modern urban character, now became part of the emergency. The alarm at 4:45 marks the point when the city's response began to move toward the building. But an alarm is not the same as rescue. It is the beginning of rescue's attempt. The fire was already burning inside a high-rise workplace filled with fuel. The timing shows the cruel mismatch between institutional response and the speed of combustion. Fire stations could be called. Firefighters could come. But the materials inside the Triangle workrooms were already doing what flammable materials do when flame reaches them, catching, feeding, carrying, and intensifying the fire. This is why the half-hour duration is so important. A disaster that lasts only about half an hour can still overwhelm every available form of response if the conditions are severe enough. In that short span, workers had to recognize the danger, stop work, move through crowded rooms, locate exits, and escape from upper floors. Firefighters had to receive the call, reach the building, assess the situation, and attempt rescue and suppression from the street and inside the structure. All of this had to happen while flame and smoke moved faster than human systems could adapt. The Triangle fire was not a slow-building industrial accident, unfolding over days or hours. It was sudden, concentrated, and fast. The speed is not a matter of dramatic exaggeration. It is grounded in the materials and layout described by the historical record. Cotton fabric burns. Paper waste burns. Scraps burn. Lint and dust can help flame travel. Thread and unfinished garments add more fuel. Crowding limits movement. Long workrooms and dense arrangements make it harder for people to turn danger into orderly escape. In those early minutes, the familiar features of the workday must be understood as mechanisms. A table was not only a table. In an emergency, it could shape a path or block one. A pile of scraps was not only waste, it could become fuel. A crowded aisle was not only an inconvenience, it could become a delay. A floor above the street was not only a place of work, it could become a place beyond easy reach. The alarm going out at 4:45 also fixes the fire within the ordinary hour of a Saturday afternoon. The work week was not yet past. The factory was still active. Workers were still inside. The city outside continued around Washington Square and Washington Place, while above the street, the interior time of the factory narrowed abruptly. There was the time of the clock, recorded in timelines and reports. And there was the time inside the burning rooms, measured in breaths, steps, blocked movement, and the distance between a worker and a usable way out. The historical record does not require invention to make this moment frightening. It is enough to hold to what is known. The fire started on the 8th floor. It spread rapidly upward through the Triangle workrooms. The rooms contained flammable materials common to shirtwaist production. The workplace was crowded. A call to fire stations went out at 4:45 in the afternoon. The fire lasted only about half an hour. Within that brief period, the disaster took the shape that would make it one of the defining labor tragedies in American history. What began as flame in a workroom became a test of every system around it: the factory's housekeeping, the building's vertical design, the arrangement of labor, the capacity of emergency response, and the routes by which workers were supposed to escape. The alarm brought the city toward the building, but inside the upper floors, the workers' chances depended first on what was closest to them: doors, aisles, stairways, tables, machines, and the possibility of movement through a room filling with danger. That is where the next layer of the catastrophe comes into focus. The fire's speed explains why seconds mattered. The workplace itself explains why so many of those seconds were lost. In the Triangle workrooms, escape was not only a question of courage or quick reaction. It depended on whether the physical routes out were open, usable, and reachable when the fire arrived. The fire's speed explains why seconds mattered. But inside the Triangle workrooms, seconds were not enough unless a worker could move. A clear path, an open door, a stairway that could be reached, a route not jammed by bodies and furniture. These were not minor details of factory design. On Saturday, March 25th, 1911, they became the difference between escape and entrapment. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the upper floors of the Asch Building at 23 to 29 Washington Place in Greenwich Village. By the time the fire began on the 8th floor and moved rapidly through the factory, the workers' first struggle was not with the city outside. It was with the workplace around them. The danger was close, practical, and immediate. It lay in doors, stairways, tables, machines, and the narrow routes between them. This is one of the hardest truths of the Triangle fire. The disaster was not made deadly only by flame. It was made deadly by the failure of escape. The Triangle workrooms were spaces of production. They were organized to make shirtwaists quickly, in large numbers, with many workers concentrated on the upper floors of a commercial building. Long tables supported cutting and sewing work. Bulky machinery filled the rooms. Workers sat or stood in dense arrangements that made sense to management as a system of output. In ordinary conditions, that layout was a business decision. In a fire, it became a physical trap. Crowded workrooms slow human movement even before panic begins. A worker has to rise, turn, move past a chair, avoid a machine, pass another worker, and find an aisle. If many people do the same thing at once, the room changes instantly. A space designed for labor becomes a space of collision. The line between an aisle and an obstruction can disappear. A long table is no longer just a work surface. It is a barrier. A machine is no longer just a tool. It is something to get around while smoke, heat, and fear are narrowing every choice. The research record identifies these conditions clearly. Workers were trapped by locked exits, doors that opened the wrong way or inward, crowded workrooms, long tables, bulky machinery, and jammed routes of escape. Each detail matters because each one removed time. And in a fire that the New York State Department of Labor describes as lasting only about half an hour, losing time meant losing the possibility of survival. The locked doors became especially important, both in the disaster itself and in the law that followed it into court. Factory doors were not simply pieces of architecture. They reflected management practices. In garment shops, control over workers' movement could be treated as part of discipline, supervision, and protection of property. Doors could be watched. Doors could be restricted. Doors could be locked. In ordinary language, a locked door sounds like one fact among many. In the Triangle fire, it became a central fact because it joined management authority to worker vulnerability. A door that cannot be opened from the inside is not only an inconvenience. During working hours, in a room filled with people, above the reach of ordinary rescue, it can become a sentence. The later criminal trial of Triangle owners Isaac Harris and Max Blanck would turn on this issue. The trial began on December 4th, 1911. Cornell's account of the investigation and trial identifies the prosecution's theory. Locking a factory door during working hours was a misdemeanor, and a misdemeanor that led to death could amount to felony manslaughter. This legal theory did not treat the fire itself as the only cause. It focused on the route of escape. It asked whether a management practice had unlawfully trapped workers when escape was most urgent. That question brought the physical layout of the factory into the courtroom. What had been a hallway, a door, a stairway, or a workroom arrangement became evidence. The prosecution focused especially on the death of Margaret Schwartz at the Washington Place door. The case did not depend only on grief or on the broad moral horror of the fire. It depended on whether the state could prove that a specific door had been locked, that the defendants knew it, and that the locking contributed to death. This is why the escape routes matter historically as well as humanly. They show how a workplace hazard can be built into routine. No one had to design a room for disaster in order to create disaster. It was enough to place many workers in crowded spaces, surround them with flammable materials, arrange tables and machines for production rather than evacuation, and limit the ways out. Once the fire began, all of those choices converged. Doors that opened inward or the wrong way added another layer. In a calm moment, a person can step back, pull a door, and pass through. In a crowd fleeing fire, that simple motion can become impossible. Pressure builds from behind. People push toward the exit. If the door must swing back toward them, the crowd itself can prevent the door from opening. The design of the door then works against the movement of the people who need it most. This was not an abstract concern for later safety engineers. It was a lived reality inside the Triangle factory. A door's direction could determine whether a line of workers kept moving or stopped. A pause at the front of a crowd became a jam behind it. A jam became entrapment. And once people were trapped on the upper floors of the Asch Building, every other failure around them became more severe. The stairways, too, were not just exits in theory. They had to be reachable and usable in practice. A stairway does not save anyone if the path to it is blocked by tables, machines, smoke, or crowds. It does not save anyone if the door leading to it cannot be opened. The Triangle Fire revealed the difference between having an exit on a plan and having an escape route in reality. That distinction became one of the disaster's lasting lessons. A factory might appear modern. The Asch Building itself was not a crumbling tenement. It was a large commercial building, completed in 1901, rising near Washington Square Park. The Triangle Waist Company operated in a modern industrial economy, producing fashionable shirtwaists for a growing market. Yet modern production did not guarantee modern safety. A bright, busy, upper-floor factory could still be organized in ways that left workers with no reliable path out. The locked and blocked routes also help explain why the Triangle Fire became more than a fire story. It became a labor story. The issue was not simply whether flame could be prevented, though that mattered. It was whether workers had power over the conditions that would determine their survival. A locked exit represented more than a technical violation. It represented a workplace in which management controlled movement, while workers carried the risk. For the young immigrant women and men inside the factory, the emergency was immediate and physical. They did not confront a legal theory. They confronted doors, tables, machines, and crowds. They confronted the problem of reaching a staircase before smoke and flame overtook them. They confronted the fact that a room built for efficient work could become almost impossible to leave when everyone needed to leave at once. The tragedy of these blocked escapes lies partly in their ordinariness. Long tables were ordinary. Bulky machines were ordinary. Crowded rooms were ordinary. Restricted doors could be treated as ordinary, but catastrophe often exposes the hidden meaning of the ordinary. It shows that the habits of a workplace are also a safety system, whether anyone calls them that or not. If those habits favor control, speed, and output over open movement, then the emergency has already been shaped before the first alarm. When the alarm went out at 4:45 in the afternoon, the city's response began. Firefighters moved toward the Asch Building. People gathered below. But for those still inside the upper floors, survival first depended on the factory's interior geography. Could they get around the tables? Could they pass the machines? Could they reach the door? Would the door open? Would the stairway carry them down? The answers were uneven, and for many workers, devastating. This is why the locked doors later carried such legal weight. They offered prosecutors a way to connect death to decision. The state did not have to say that Harris and Blanck had intended the workers to die. The argument was different. If a factory door was locked during working hours, and if that unlawful act helped cause death, then responsibility could rise to manslaughter. In that theory, the door became the hinge between workplace practice and criminal law. The jury would later acquit Harris and Blanck, a result that will matter when the trial enters the story more fully. But before the legal outcome, before the courtroom strategies of prosecutor Charles S. Bostwick and defense attorney Max D. Stoyer, before Judge Thomas C.T. Crane presided over the case, there was the factory itself. There were the rooms. There were the exits. There were the people trying to move through a workplace that had not been arranged for their escape. The Triangle Fire forced New York to see that safety could not be measured only by whether a building stood upright or whether work could proceed on a normal day. Safety had to be measured under stress, in smoke, in panic, in the crush of bodies moving toward a door. A road of escape had to work not for one person walking calmly, but for many people fleeing at once. And even where workers found a way out of the rooms, the problem of escape did not end at the threshold. Beyond the doors and stairways lay the building's external means of rescue, the fragile promise that a fire escape could carry trapped workers down from the upper floors. In the Asch Building, that promise would fail as well. Beyond the doors and stairways of the Triangle workrooms was another promise of safety, the fire escape. It was the kind of feature that could make danger seem accounted for. A building might rise above the street. A factory might operate on upper floors. Hundreds of workers might spend long hours far above the reach of ordinary exit routes. But if there was a fire escape attached to the outside, then in theory, there was another way down. The Triangle Fire exposed the terrible weakness in that assumption. According to OSHA, the Asch Building had only one fire escape. During the rescue effort, that fire escape collapsed. Those two facts belong together. The building was not a low structure where people could step directly out into open air. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Asch Building at 23 to 29 Washington Place, just east of Washington Square Park. Its workers were not near the street. They were working high above it in a factory that depended on elevators, stairways, doors, and the building's external escape structure to move people out in an emergency. On an ordinary day, that height may have seemed like part of modern city life. New York was a vertical city. Factories, offices, and loft buildings rose above crowded streets. The Asch Building itself had the appearance of a modern industrial structure for its time, but the fire revealed that height changed everything. A workplace on an upper floor did not merely need an exit. It needed an exit system that could still function when hundreds of people were trying to flee at once, when smoke and heat were spreading, and when the people inside had only minutes to live. A single fire escape was not such a system. It is important to pause over what a fire escape meant in this setting. It was not a broad interior stairway designed to carry a crowd. It was not a protected route isolated from heat, smoke, and panic. It was a secondary path, attached to the building, meant to offer a way down when ordinary exits failed or could not be reached. Its value depended entirely on whether workers could get to it, whether it could hold them, and whether it could carry them down from the upper floors under the pressure of an actual disaster. In the Triangle Fire, the need was immediate. The fire had begun on the 8th floor and spread rapidly through workrooms filled with lightweight cotton fabric, paper waste, fabric scraps, lint, thread, dust, and other flammable material. The New York State Department of Labor describes the fire as lasting only about half an hour. That short duration matters. A fire escape in such a disaster did not have hours to prove itself. It had minutes. Workers who could not move through locked or jammed interior routes had to look for any other possibility. In a high-rise factory, an outside fire escape could appear to be that possibility. But a fire escape is only a promise if it remains standing. The collapse of the Asch Building's fire escape turned a supposed safeguard into another point of failure. For workers trapped on the upper floors, this failure mattered because it narrowed an already shrinking set of choices. Inside were crowded workrooms, long tables, bulky machinery, doors that could not be used quickly enough or at all, and stairways that became difficult to reach or pass through. Outside, below them, was the street. Between the two was the fire escape, the structure that was supposed to connect danger above with safety below. When that structure failed, the workers who depended on it lost more than a piece of metal attached to a wall. They lost time. They lost capacity. They lost one of the few routes that might have allowed people high in the building to descend without waiting for rescue from the street. This is where the Triangle disaster becomes more than a story of one blocked door or one bad workplace habit. The fire escape's collapse shows how safety can be made to look present without being adequate. A building may technically have a fire escape and still leave workers in mortal danger. A regulation or expectation may assume that an outside structure provides protection, while the actual conditions of panic, crowding, height, and fire reveal that the protection is too weak. The workers inside the Triangle Waste Company did not need a symbolic exit. They needed a working one. They needed routes that could handle the real number of people employed in the factory. The Triangle workforce numbered about 500. Not all of them were in the same place at the same instant, and not all faced the same route of escape, but the scale is essential. This was not a small shop with a handful of workers. It was a large garment factory spread across the upper floors of a 10-story building. Any emergency plan had to match that reality. The fire escape did not. The larger failure was a mismatch between industrial modernity and worker protection. The factory system could concentrate people, machines, fabric, and production speed on upper floors. It could use the height and space of a city loft building to manufacture fashionable shirtwaists for a growing market. It could organize labor around long tables, rows of machines, and dense workrooms. But the safety measures did not rise to the same level of seriousness. The productive system was modern and large. The escape system was fragile and insufficient. That contradiction was one of the reasons the Triangle Fire became so powerful in public memory. The disaster did not happen because no one could imagine fire. Fire was a known hazard in garment work. The materials themselves made that clear: cotton fabric, paper waste, scraps, lint, thread, and dust. Nor did it happen in some hidden corner of the city, completely removed from public view. It happened in Greenwich Village, near Washington Square Park, inside a building that later would become the Brown Building, part of New York University. The horror was not that danger had been unimaginable. It was that the systems meant to answer danger were so inadequate when tested. A fire escape, like a door, is a small thing until the moment it becomes everything. On a normal day, it may sit unnoticed against the outside wall of a building. Workers may pass near its access point without thinking about it. Owners may treat its presence as evidence that the building has a secondary exit. Inspectors, lawmakers, and the public may assume that such structures help solve the problem of fire in tall buildings. But the Triangle Fire showed that the question could not simply be, does a fire escape exist? The question had to be, can it save people under the conditions in which it will actually be needed? Can it be reached from the workrooms when smoke and flame are spreading? Can people move toward it without being trapped by tables, machines, doors, or crowding? Can it carry many workers at once? Can it withstand the weight and urgency of rescue? Can it provide a real descent from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors to safety? In the Asch Building, the answer was no. The collapse also deepened the disaster for rescuers. Firefighters arrived to confront a fire high above the street, with workers trapped on the upper floors and routes of escape failing inside and outside the building. Rescue in such a setting depended on layers of protection. If workers could leave by stairways, fewer would need outside rescue. If doors opened and routes remained passable, fewer would be forced toward desperate alternatives. If the fire escape held, it could carry some down from above. But as each layer failed, the burden shifted to the next one. And the next one was the fire department's ability to reach the trapped workers from below. This is the hard logic of the Triangle Fire. Each failure made the following failure more deadly. Locked or blocked routes increased reliance on other exits. The inadequate fire escape increased reliance on outside rescue. The height of the building increased reliance on equipment that could reach the upper floors. What might have been separate safety problems became linked in a chain. That chain was especially lethal because of where the workers were. The 8th, 9th, and 10th floors were not simply upper floors in a general sense. They were high enough to turn escape into an engineering problem. A worker on those floors could not simply break a window and climb down. A crowd could not improvise a safe descent from that height. The difference between a usable structure and a failed one was the difference between a root and a drop. The fire escape's collapse therefore stands as one of the clearest examples of the disaster's broader lesson. Workplace safety cannot depend on measures that are too few, too weak, or too poorly matched to the danger. The presence of a safety feature is not the same as protection. Protection requires capacity. It requires design. It requires enforcement. It requires imagining not the calmest possible use of an exit, but the worst moment in which that exit must work. For the workers of the Triangle Waste Company, that worst moment came on Saturday, March 25th, 1911. It came in the late afternoon, after the alarm had gone out, as fire moved through rooms where the ordinary materials of garment production had become fuel. It came when workers tried to move through a workplace never built, arranged, or managed with their survival at the center. And outside the building, the city could see the cruel geometry of the disaster. Workers were high above the street. The fire escape had failed. The roots within the building had failed too many of them. Rescue now depended on what could be done from below. But the height of the Asch Building presented one more limit. Even as firefighters arrived, even as the city looked upward, the upper factory floors remained beyond the easy reach of rescue. The failure of the fire escape left trapped workers dependent on ladders, hoses, nets, and human urgency rising from the street. And there, too, the modern city had built higher than its emergency tools could safely follow. The failure of the fire escape left rescue to the street. It left workers on the upper floors dependent on what firefighters could raise from below and on what the city's emergency tools could do against the height of the Asch Building. That height now became more than an architectural fact. It became a boundary. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Asch Building at 23 to 29 Washington Place. By the standards of industrial New York, this was a modern arrangement, a large garment factory housed high above the street in a building completed in the early 20th century, close to Washington Square Park and in the middle of a dense urban neighborhood. The factory made shirtwaists, fashionable blouses produced in workrooms organized for speed and volume. But on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, when fire moved through those upper floors, the same vertical city that had made this kind of factory possible also limited the rescue that could be offered from outside. OSHA states the fact plainly. Firefighters' ladders were too short to reach the top factory floors. Cornell's timeline makes the limit even more stark, noting that the ladders did not reach above the 6th floor. The Triangle workers were on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. That gap matters. It is not only a measurement of equipment. It is a measurement of distance between industrial ambition and public safety. The building could lift production higher than the city's rescue equipment could effectively reach. Workers could be placed floor after floor above the street, but when escape routes failed, when the fire escape collapsed, and when smoke and flame cut off movement inside, the external means of rescue stopped below them. The fire department could arrive. Firefighters could look up. Crowds could gather in the street. The emergency itself could be fully visible, but visibility was not the same as access. The people trapped above were not hidden in a remote place. They were in Greenwich Village, in Manhattan, in a building known to the city and embedded in its commercial life. And still, the tools available from the street could not bridge the full vertical distance between the pavement and the factory floors. This is one of the cruelest aspects of the Triangle Fire. The disaster unfolded not in isolation, but in public. The Asch Building stood just east of Washington Square Park. It was surrounded by the city, by streets, by institutions, by witnesses. Yet those witnesses could see more than they could do. The upper windows of the factory became points of unbearable attention because they marked the place where workers were trapped, beyond the reach of the ladders. The problem was not simply that the building was tall. Tall buildings were part of the emerging modern city. The problem was that industrial life had moved upward without safety systems keeping pace. A factory was not an office where a smaller number of people might move through corridors in ordinary rhythms. Triangle's workrooms held hundreds of workers across the company's floors, with long tables, machines, fabric, paper waste, thread, lint, dust, and the ordinary materials of garment production. The fire began on the 8th floor and spread rapidly upward through spaces where those materials helped feed it. The New York State Department of Labor states that the fire lasted only about half an hour. In that short span, Every weakness in the building's safety arrangements was tested at once. Doors and passageways mattered inside. The fire escape mattered outside. And then the ladders mattered from the street. Each system might have seemed like a separate safeguard, but in the actual emergency, they became linked. If interior exits were blocked, locked, crowded, or impossible to use, workers needed another way out. If the single fire escape failed, workers needed rescue from below. If the ladders could not reach the upper floors, rescue from below had a hard limit. That sequence reveals why the disaster cannot be understood as the failure of one object or one decision alone. It was not only a locked door. It was not only a crowded workroom. It was not only combustible fabric and paper waste. It was not only the collapse of a fire escape. It was the way all these conditions met the height of the building. The Asch Building's upper floors turned each failure into something more final. A door that could not be opened on a low floor might still leave other possibilities. A failed fire escape closer to the ground might still leave a reachable ladder. But on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, the margin narrowed sharply. The ladder's limit also shows how technology can lag behind the city it is meant to protect. Urban industrial design had created workplaces in the air. Elevators, steel construction, and taller commercial buildings allowed employers to concentrate production above street level. But fire rescue still depended in part on physical reach, a ladder raised from the ground toward a window. When that ladder stopped below the workers, the city's vertical growth became a danger in itself. This was not an abstract engineering problem for the people in the factory. It shaped the decisions available to them in the last minutes of the fire. If the stairways could not be reached, if doors did not function as escape routes, if the fire escape could not carry them down, then windows became the visible edge of the possible. The street below represented help, but help that could not climb high enough. The upper floors became a place where people were close enough to be seen and too far away to be reached. Cornell's timeline, by recording that ladders did not reach above the 6th floor, helps preserve that terrible proportion. The 6th floor was below the factory. The workers were above it. Between the top of the ladder and the floors where people were trapped lay the distance that modern industry had created and public rescue had not yet mastered. OSHA's statement that the ladders were too short turns the same fact into an indictment of preparedness. Not because firefighters lacked urgency, but because urgency alone could not change the height of the building or the length of the equipment. This distinction matters. The limits faced by firefighters should not be mistaken for indifference. The record points to a structural problem. The available rescue tools did not match the conditions of the workplace. Firefighters could respond to the alarm, and Cornell's timeline places the call to fire stations at 4:45 in the afternoon. But response time and courage could not solve every hazard that had been built into the situation long before the fire began. A factory operating on the top floors of a 10-story building required safety measures capable of protecting workers at that height. When those measures failed, the arriving firefighters confronted the consequences of decisions made in architecture, management, inspection, and law. That is why the ladders are such a powerful detail. They make the disaster visible as a failure of scale. The factory was scaled for production. The workrooms were scaled for output. The building was scaled for the modern city. But the systems meant to protect human life were not scaled to the same height, density, and risk. The result was a workplace where workers could be placed above the practical reach of rescue. In the aftermath, reformers would look closely at many parts of factory life: fire hazards, exits, inspection, sprinklers, sanitation, and the responsibilities of employers and the state. But even before formal investigations translated outrage into legislation, the scene at Washington Place had already exposed a basic truth. Industrial modernity had outrun the safety assumptions that surrounded it. A building could appear solid, respectable, and permanent, yet still contain a deadly mismatch between where people worked and how they could be saved. The Asch Building itself survived. Later known as the Brown Building, it would become part of New York University and would eventually receive landmark recognition. Its continued presence gives the story a strange physical continuity. The walls remained. The address remained. The city around it continued to change. But on that March afternoon, permanence belonged to the structure, not to the people inside it. The workers on the upper floors were the ones exposed to the building's most unforgiving fact: Once the routes down failed, the distance to the street could not be overcome. The short ladders also force attention back to the workers' position in the city. Many of them were young immigrant women from Jewish and Italian immigrant communities, part of New York's garment workforce. They labored in a factory that supplied a popular garment for a changing society, yet their own safety depended on arrangements that proved disastrously inadequate. They were not beyond rescue because they were far from civilization. They were beyond rescue inside one of the nation's great cities, in a workplace that represented the city's modern industrial economy. So the image of ladders stopping below the factory floors becomes more than a detail of emergency response. It becomes a symbol of the gap between progress and protection. The city had built upward. The garment industry had organized labor into high-floor production rooms. Employers had filled those rooms with workers and materials. But when fire came, the rescue ladder ended below the people who needed it most. By the time the flames were extinguished, the limits of rescue had become part of the death toll. The fire lasted only about half an hour, but in that half hour, the boundaries of escape were drawn with brutal clarity. The blocked or unusable way out, the collapsed fire escape, the ladder that could not reach. What remained afterward was not only wreckage inside a factory. It was the recognition that 146 people had died in a disaster the city had been able to witness, but not fully stop. By the time the flames were out, the failure of rescue had become a number. Not an estimate of damage, not a count of machines lost or floors burned, but a count of human beings who had gone to work in the upper stories of the Asch Building and did not come home. The Triangle Fire lasted only about half an hour. Its death toll would remain one of the starkest facts in American labor history: 146 workers killed. Britannica reports the toll as 129 women and 17 men. Even stated plainly, the figure is difficult to hold. It is large enough to describe a public disaster, but it is made of individual lives, workers at tables, cutters and operators, people who had been earning wages in the garment trade, many of them young, many of them immigrants, many of them daughters, sisters, wives, neighbors, and friends in the dense immigrant world of New York City. The Triangle Waist Company was not an isolated workplace on the edge of the city. It was part of a wider garment economy that depended heavily on immigrant labor. New York's shirtwaist industry drew workers from Jewish and Italian immigrant communities, among others, and many of those workers were women and girls whose wages mattered to their families. The factory at Washington Place was one location within a much larger system of production, cutting, sewing, finishing, pressing, and moving garments quickly through the market. The deaths at Triangle therefore struck not only a company or even one building, but an entire working world. That is why the number 146 carried such force. It belonged to families who waited for workers to return from a Saturday shift. It belonged to neighborhoods where the garment trade was not an abstraction, but a daily routine. It belonged to immigrant households in which factory work could mean survival, independence, obligation, or all of these at once. A shirtwaist was a fashionable and practical garment, but behind its production stood a workforce whose vulnerability had been made visible in the most public way. The victims were not soldiers, not people who had chosen a known field of danger, not rescuers who had volunteered for risk. They were wage earners in a modern city. They had been making clothing in a building that stood near Washington Square Park, in a district associated with education, reform, commerce, and urban modernity. The Asch Building itself would remain standing. The workrooms could be described, inspected, argued over, and eventually remembered. But the people lost inside and around that building were gone within minutes. The composition of the death toll matters because it reveals who bore the greatest risk in this part of the industrial city. 129 of the dead were women. Many were young immigrant women. Their presence in the factory reflected both the opportunities and the pressures of the garment industry. Factory wages could offer young women a measure of earning power, but the conditions of work were shaped by crowded rooms, speed, low margins, and managerial control. In such a setting, danger did not always announce itself as danger. It could be built into the ordinary arrangement of the workday. A door, a table, a stairway, a locked exit, a single fire escape, a ladder that could not reach. Before the fire, these could appear as separate details. Afterward, they formed a chain. But the human toll gives that chain its meaning. The disaster was not only that safety systems failed, it was that they failed around living people, many of whom had only minutes to understand what was happening and almost no time to act. The dead included men as well as women, and their number, 17, should not disappear inside the larger emphasis on young women workers. Men worked in the shop too, in the same system, under the same sudden threat. But the overwhelming number of women killed gave the disaster a particular social and political force. It exposed the vulnerability of women workers in a labor market that relied on them while often leaving their safety in the hands of employers, building practices, and inspection systems that had not protected them. In the days after the fire, the work of naming the dead became part of the aftermath. Identification was not only a bureaucratic task. It was an act of restoration, an attempt to return individuality to people who had been caught in a mass casualty event. Families searched, officials recorded, newspapers printed names, communities mourned. Yet even this process was incomplete for a long time. The fire had been so destructive and the circumstances of death so difficult that not every victim was fully identified in the immediate historical record. That incompleteness lasted for a century. According to Cornell's Heal Center, the final 6 unidentified Triangle victims were identified in 2011 through research by independent researcher Michael Hirsch. Their names were Josephine Camerata, Dora Evans, Max Florin, Maria Giuseppa Lauletti, Concetta Prestafilippo, and Fanny Rosen. The late identification of these 6 victims is one of the quietest and most important parts of the Triangle story. It shows that the fire did not end, historically, when the last flames were extinguished. It did not end when the building was cleaned, or when the courts met, or when new laws were proposed. The work of memory continued. Records had to be read closely. Names had to be recovered from fragments. The dead had to be brought back, as fully as possible, from anonymity into the human record. Michael Hirsch's research, recognized by Cornell's Heal Center, reminds us that history is not only made in legislatures, courtrooms, and public commissions. It is also made in archives, in patient comparison, in the insistence that a person lost in a catastrophe should not remain unnamed if evidence can restore that name. The identification of the final 6 victims in 2011 did not change the death toll. It changed the completeness of remembrance. This matters because mass death can flatten human beings into a single figure. 146 is necessary to say. It tells us the scale. It marks the disaster in public memory. It helps explain why the Triangle Fire became a turning point rather than a forgotten workplace accident. But a number can also conceal what it contains. It can make the dead seem distant, almost abstract. The names resist that flattening. Josephine Camerata, Dora Evans, Max Florin, Maria Giuseppa Lauletti, Concetta Prestafilippo, Fanny Rosen. These names belong beside the larger count because the historical meaning of the Triangle Fire depends on both scale and individuality. The scale made the city look. The individuality made it impossible for many to look away. The victims' immigrant identities also shaped how the disaster was understood. In the early 20th century garment trade, immigrant labor was central to production. Workers brought languages, customs, family networks, and political traditions into the shops. They also encountered the hard terms of industrial employment in a city where regulation had not kept pace with the speed and density of manufacturing. The Triangle Fire exposed that imbalance. It showed how an economy could depend on immigrant workers while failing to provide them with reliable protection. This was not simply a story of poverty, though poverty and low wages were part of the world around it. It was also a story of modern urban labor. The Triangle workers were employed in a high-floor factory, producing garments for a mass market inside a city that prided itself on growth and progress. Their deaths forced a question that could no longer be treated as theoretical. What did modern industry owe to the people whose labor made it profitable? The answer had not been secured before the fire. Workers had organized and struck in the years before the disaster, including in the shirtwaist industry, but the conditions inside many shops remained dangerous. The deaths at Triangle gave those earlier labor struggles a new and terrible evidence. Arguments about safety, exits, hours, supervision, and enforcement could now be measured against 146 bodies. The public would soon gather the evidence into grief, anger, speeches, funerals, investigations, and demands. But before public outrage could take shape, there was the first fact of loss. Families had to learn who was dead. Communities had to absorb the absence of young women and men who had been part of their daily life. A city had to confront the knowledge that the disaster had unfolded in view of the street, near the heart of Manhattan, and still the workers could not be saved. The toll of the Triangle Fire was therefore more than the end of the event. It was the beginning of its meaning. 146 dead, 129 women and 17 men, many young, many immigrant. Workers in a garment economy that had made their labor ordinary, necessary, and too often disposable. In the silence after the fire, the number became a charge laid before the city. Mourning would not remain private for long. Mourning would not remain private for long, because the Triangle Fire had not happened out of sight. It had burned in Greenwich Village, just east of Washington Square Park, in the upper floors of a building that belonged to the visible modern city. People on the street had seen smoke, flames, firefighters, ladders, and the terrifying distance between the workers and any possible rescue. Families and communities carried the deepest grief, but the disaster also entered public life almost immediately, because what had failed was not only one workplace. What had failed was a whole promise of urban progress. The Asch Building stood at 23 to 29 Washington Place. It was not a hidden workshop in a back alley. It was a modern factory building, later known as the Brown Building, in one of the most recognizable parts of Manhattan. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Inside, hundreds of workers made shirtwaists, the popular blouses worn by women in the early 20th century. Outside, New York moved through an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Then, at about 4:45 in the afternoon, according to Cornell's timeline, the alarm went out to fire stations. That public setting mattered. Industrial deaths could be buried in the language of accident, risk, or private misfortune. But the Triangle Fire became harder to dismiss because the city could see the consequences. The flames lasted only about half an hour, as the New York State Department of Labor notes, but that half hour made visible what reformers and workers had been saying for years, that the conditions of production could be lethal, and that the people most exposed to those dangers had the least power to change them. The death toll itself forced attention. 146 workers were killed. Britannica reports that 129 were women and 17 were men. Many were young immigrant women from Jewish and Italian immigrant communities. These were workers whose labor helped sustain the garment economy of New York City, whose hands turned fabric into fashionable clothing, and whose wages were tied to the speed and discipline of mass production. Their deaths made the abstract human cost of the industry unmistakable. The grief fell first on families. Parents, siblings, husbands, wives, friends, neighbors, and co-workers had to absorb the sudden absence of people who had left for work and never returned. But because so many victims came from immigrant communities, the grief also moved through dense networks of neighborhood, language, religion, and labor. These were not isolated losses. They were repeated losses across communities already familiar with long hours, insecure employment, and the pressure of factory life. The identity of the victims shaped the outrage. The dead were not powerful industrialists or public officials. They were wage earners, many of them young women, in an industry that depended heavily on immigrant labor. Their vulnerability was not incidental to the story. It was central. The same garment economy that made the shirtwaist affordable and fashionable also concentrated workers in crowded rooms filled with cotton fabric, paper waste, fabric scraps, lint, thread, and dust. The same workplace discipline that governed movement inside the shop could turn locked or blocked exits into a matter of survival. Public anger grew because the deaths seemed preventable. The fire was fast, but its speed alone did not explain the toll. Workers had faced locked doors, doors that opened the wrong way or inward, crowded workrooms, long tables, bulky machinery, and jammed routes of escape. OSHA states that the building had only one fire escape, and that it collapsed during the rescue effort. Firefighters arrived, but their ladders were too short to reach the top factory floors. Cornell's timeline states that the ladders did not reach above the 6th floor. From the street, the city could witness both effort and helplessness at once. That combination gave the disaster its political force. If people had died because no one came, the story might have been about neglect in the moment. But firefighters did come. The alarm was sent. Rescue was attempted. The problem was that the tools, exits, rules, and building conditions were inadequate before the first flame appeared. The disaster exposed a chain of failure: materials that fed the fire, workrooms that slowed escape, doors that could trap workers, a fire escape that could not bear the emergency, and ladders that could not reach the floors where people were trapped. Outrage came from seeing that this chain was not mysterious. It was built into the ordinary operation of the factory. The Triangle shop was part of a larger, ready-to-wear economy, one that prized output, speed, and control. The workers' daily environment had been organized around production. But when fire broke out, that organization became deadly. Tables, machines, locked routes, and high floors were no longer neutral features of a workplace. They became evidence. This is why the Triangle Fire did not remain a private industrial tragedy. It became a public event because it connected personal mourning to questions the city could no longer avoid. Who was responsible for making factories safe? What did employers owe workers beyond wages? What did the law require when profit depended on dense rooms and fast labor? What was the value of a fire escape if it failed when needed? What was the meaning of a modern building if people inside it could not get out? The answers did not appear all at once. But the fire entered a city where labor unrest and reform networks already existed. Shirtwaist workers had taken part in the uprising of the 20,000 in New York City before the fire. Organizations such as the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Women's Trade Union League had already pressed concerns about wages, hours, and shop conditions. Figures connected to garment labor and reform, including Clara Lemlich, Rose Schneiderman, Pauline Newman, and Frances Perkins, belonged to a wider world of activism and public argument that could carry grief into politics. Frances Perkins gave that passage from witness to policy a particularly long arc. She witnessed the Triangle Fire and later became New York State Industrial Commissioner. In 1933, she became United States Secretary of Labor, the first woman to serve in a federal cabinet position. Her later career reminds us that the meaning of the Triangle Fire was not contained in the day itself. The fire became part of a continuing argument about government responsibility, worker protection, and the enforceable standards needed to make industrial life less deadly. The immediate pressure would soon take institutional form. The New York State Factory Investigating Commission was created by law in 1911 as a reaction to the Triangle Fire. Its work would examine fire hazards, sanitary conditions, occupational disease, factory inspection, tenement manufacturing, and related workplace issues. According to the United States Department of Labor, Robert F. Wagner and Alfred E. Smith were crucial figures in the commission and in turning recommendations into law. But before investigation could become legislation, public feeling had to become impossible for officials to ignore. That transformation was the central consequence of public grief. The dead were mourned as individuals, but the conditions that killed them were judged as social facts. The locked exits, failed fire escape, unreachable floors, and flammable workrooms became more than details of a single fire. They became arguments for inspection, regulation, and legal accountability. The public did not need to understand every technical feature of factory safety to grasp the basic truth: a city that allowed workers to labor high above rescue, behind unsafe routes of escape, had accepted dangers it could no longer defend. There was also a moral contradiction at the heart of the outrage. The shirtwaist represented modern life for many women: movement, practicality, work, and changing public roles. The Smithsonian notes that shirtwaists were useful for working-class women because they were easier to clean and allowed greater freedom of movement than a full dress. Yet the workers who made that garment were themselves caught in a workplace where freedom of movement could be sharply limited. A blouse associated with mobility had been produced under conditions where escape, at the decisive moment, failed. The Triangle Fire, therefore, turned consumer culture back toward its hidden labor. The garment was familiar. The workers had been less visible. After the fire, the distance between the finished blouse and the factory floor narrowed. The public could no longer see the shirtwaist only as a product of fashion or convenience. It was also a product of long tables, machines, scraps, lint, dust, crowded rooms, and workers whose safety depended on decisions made by owners, builders, inspectors, and lawmakers. Public outrage did not mean that justice would be simple. Anger could fill streets, newspapers, speeches, and meetings, but courts required charges, evidence, legal theories, and proof. The deaths had raised a broad moral accusation against the conditions of the factory. The law would have to narrow that accusation into specific claims of criminal responsibility. In the case of Triangle owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blanck, attention would focus especially on the question of locked factory doors during working hours and on whether such a violation, if it led to death, could support a charge as serious as manslaughter. By then, the city's mourning had already changed the terrain. The fire was no longer only a tragedy remembered by families and co-workers. It had become a public reckoning with industrial power, immigrant labor, women's work, urban height, and the limits of rescue. The 146 dead stood at the center of that reckoning, not as a statistic alone, but as the reason grief became pressure. And once grief became pressure, the demand for accountability moved from the street toward the courtroom. The demand for accountability moved from the street toward the courtroom, but the courtroom could not hold the whole weight of what New York had seen. Public grief had named a broad failure, a factory system that placed young workers high above the street, among flammable materials, behind exits that could become barriers. Criminal law required something narrower. It required a charge, a statute, an act, a person to blame beyond moral responsibility. In the trial of Isaac Harris and Max Blanck, the owners of the Triangle Waste Company, that narrowing became the central drama. The criminal trial began on December 4th, 1911, less than 9 months after the fire. By then, the outlines of the disaster were known across the city. The Triangle Waste Company had occupied the upper floors of the Asch Building on Washington Place. 146 workers had died. Many had been trapped by failed routes of escape. The public had already absorbed the terrible meaning of locked doors, crowded workrooms, and rescue equipment that could not reach the highest factory floors. But a criminal trial is not a public meeting, and it is not a memorial. It does not ask whether an industrial order is cruel or whether a city has tolerated danger too long. It asks whether the defendants committed a crime as the law defines it, and whether the evidence proves that crime beyond the required legal threshold. That was the difference between outrage and conviction. It was the difference the prosecution had to cross. Cornell's trial materials identify the central courtroom figures. The prosecutor was Charles S. Bostwick. The defense counsel was Max D. Stoyer. The judge was Thomas C. T. Crane. Their roles placed them at the point where the fire's public meaning entered the machinery of law. Bostwick had to translate the disaster into a legal theory of manslaughter. Stoyer had to defend Harris and Blanck against that theory. Judge Crane presided over the rules by which the jury would hear the evidence and decide whether the state had proved its case. The prosecution's theory turned on the question of a locked factory door during working hours. Under the law, locking such a door could be treated as a misdemeanor. The larger legal claim was that if that misdemeanor led to death, it could amount to felony manslaughter. In other words, the state did not have to prove that Harris and Blanck meant for anyone to die. The claim was that an unlawful act, if it caused death, could carry criminal responsibility at the level of manslaughter. That theory mattered because it connected an ordinary management practice to a fatal result. A locked door might have been treated in daily factory life as a tool of control. Control of movement, control of brakes, control of property, control of the workforce. But after the fire, such a door looked very different. It was no longer only a feature of shop discipline. It became a possible cause of death. The courtroom focus included the death of Margaret Schwartz at the Washington Place door. Her case gave the prosecution a specific human and physical point around which to build its argument. Rather than trying to prosecute the entire catastrophe at once, Bostwick's case had to show that a particular blocked or locked exit mattered in a particular death. The broader disaster gave the trial its moral force, but the legal case depended on proof of connection, a door, a condition, a death, and responsibility. This was one of the hardest transformations in the aftermath of Triangle. The public knew that many workers had been unable to escape. Witnesses, families, reformers, and journalists could see the pattern. But the law asked for evidence that could be tied tightly to the defendants. It was not enough to say that the factory was dangerous. It was not enough to say that the fire revealed a system of neglect. The prosecution had to show that Harris and Blanck were criminally liable under the law as it stood at the time. The defense, led by Max D. Stoyer, worked within that narrowness. The defense did not have to prove that the factory had been safe in any broad moral sense. It had to create doubt about the prosecution's case. If the jury could not be certain that the door was locked at the decisive moment, or could not be certain that the defendants knew of that condition in the way the law required, or could not connect that condition clearly enough to the death at issue, then the criminal charge would fail. This is why the trial is so important to the larger history of the Triangle Fire. It shows both the power and the limits of criminal accountability after an industrial disaster. The fire had made danger visible. It had revealed the consequences of blocked exits, inadequate escape routes, and high-rise factory work. It had turned private grief into public outrage. Yet the criminal law still moved through a narrower passage. It did not simply punish the existence of unsafe conditions because the public recognized them as intolerable. It required a provable violation, a provable causal chain, and a provable connection to the defendants. The legal theory itself carried a sharp moral implication. If locking a factory door during working hours was a misdemeanor, then the law already recognized that workers needed unobstructed escape. The rule was not an abstract formality. In a factory filled with fabric, paper waste, scraps, lint, thread, dust, and machinery, an exit could become the difference between survival and death within minutes. The prosecution's argument treated the locked door as the link between regulatory violation and human loss. But the trial also exposed how fragile such a link could be in court. The fire had been fast. The rooms had been crowded. Panic, smoke, and flame had overtaken people in a setting where memories and observations were made under terror. The prosecution had to reconstruct the movement of workers and the condition of doors at the most chaotic moment of their lives. The defense could press on uncertainty, inconsistency, and the limits of what witnesses could know. For families of the dead, this legal narrowness could feel like another failure of recognition. 146 people had died, but the trial could not fully ask why so many hazards had been allowed to coexist. It could not fully weigh the combined effect of upper-floor production, flammable materials, a collapsed fire escape, locked or blocked exits, and firefighting equipment unable to reach the highest floors. Those facts belong to the story of the disaster. Only some could become the foundation of a criminal conviction. On December 27, 1911, Harris and Blanck were acquitted. The verdict did not erase public knowledge of the fire, and it did not end the demand for change. But it made clear that punishment through a criminal trial would not be the main route by which the Triangle disaster transformed American labor. The courtroom had been asked to answer a question of guilt under existing law. Its answer left untouched the larger question that had filled the streets after the fire. How could the conditions that made such a disaster possible be prevented from recurring? That question required a different kind of response. It required investigation not of one door alone, but of factories, fire hazards, sanitation, occupational disease, inspection, and tenement manufacturing. It required lawmakers and reformers to move beyond the limits of a single prosecution and examine the structure of industrial work itself. The acquittal of Harris and Blanck did not quiet the city's anger. It redirected it. If the courtroom could not deliver the full measure of accountability many had hoped for, then accountability would have to take another form: inquiry, regulation, and law. If the courtroom could not answer the larger question, the state would have to ask it another way. The criminal trial of Isaac Harris and Max Blanck had narrowed attention to proof, intent, and the legal meaning of a locked factory door. But the Triangle Fire had exposed something wider than one door, one shop, or one pair of owners. It had revealed a system of industrial work in which danger could be ordinary, visible, and still insufficiently controlled. That broader response took institutional form in the New York State Factory Investigating Commission. Created by law in 1911 and dated by the U.S. Department of Labor to June 30th of that year, the commission was a direct reaction to the Triangle Fire. Its creation marked a shift from outrage to organized inquiry. Public grief had filled the streets. The trial had tested the limits of criminal accountability. Now the state began to build a record. The significance of that step is easy to miss if we think of investigation as passive as a delay before action. In this case, investigation became a form of power. The commission could look beyond the particular facts of the Triangle Waste Company and examine the conditions that made factory disaster possible. It could ask what hazards were common in workplaces across New York. It could gather testimony, inspect buildings, and connect what had happened in Greenwich Village to a larger industrial landscape. The commission's work was broad because the problem was broad. It studied fire hazards, the most immediate and haunting issue after the flames in the Asch Building. But it also examined sanitary conditions, occupational disease, factory inspection, tenement manufacturing, and related workplace issues. In other words, the state did not treat the Triangle Fire only as a fire. It treated it as evidence of a deeper failure in the regulation of work. Fire hazards remained central because the mechanism of the disaster had been so clear. In the Triangle workrooms, ordinary materials of garment production had become fuel: cotton fabric, paper waste, scraps, lint, thread, dust, and the dry accumulation of mass production. The fire had moved through a workplace where speed, density, and flammable materials were part of daily business. The Commission's attention to fire hazards therefore reached beyond the spectacular moment of catastrophe. It asked what factories stored, how they were arranged, how workers could leave them, and whether emergency protections existed before panic began. Sanitary conditions widened the inquiry further. Reform after Triangle was not only about dramatic emergencies. It was also about the slower injuries of industrial life, crowded rooms, inadequate facilities, and the health consequences of workplaces treated mainly as sites of output. A factory could be dangerous even when it was not burning. By studying sanitation, the Commission moved the discussion from rescue to prevention, from disaster response to the everyday conditions that shaped workers' bodies and lives. Occupational disease made that same point in another way. The danger of factory labor was not always sudden, visible, or newsworthy. It could accumulate in the lungs, in fatigue, in exposure, and in the repeated contact between workers and the materials of production. The Triangle Fire had forced New Yorkers to look upward at workers trapped on high floors, but the Commission's mandate required a longer gaze. It asked what work did to people over time. Factory inspection was another crucial area, because law without enforcement could become a promise without force. The Triangle Fire had shown that danger could exist in a modern urban factory, in a building not hidden from public view, in the middle of Manhattan. The question was not simply whether standards could be written. It was whether anyone would inspect, measure, require, and return. A system of inspection meant that safety could no longer depend only on the judgment of employers or the luck of workers. It implied that the state had a continuing role inside the industrial workplace. The Commission also studied tenement manufacturing, a reminder that the garment industry did not exist only in large loft factories. Work could move between factories, workshops, homes, and small production spaces, spreading risk across the city in less visible forms. By including tenement manufacturing, the Commission treated the garment economy as a network rather than a single location. The Asch Building had become the symbol, but the problem extended beyond Washington Place. This breadth mattered politically. The fire had made reform urgent, but urgency alone does not write durable law. The Commission helped convert moral shock into usable knowledge. It gave lawmakers a way to say not only that something terrible had happened, but what specific conditions allowed such dangers to persist. Its investigation supplied the bridge between mourning and legislation. Among the figures associated with that bridge were Robert F. Wagner, Alfred E. Smith, and Abram Elkis. The U.S. Department of Labor identifies Wagner and Smith as crucial figures in the Factory Investigating Commission and in turning recommendations into law. Their importance lay not only in sympathy for reform, but in the legislative labor required to move from findings to statutes. After Triangle, public feeling was intense, but feeling had to be organized into bills, debates, votes, and administrative systems. Wagner and Smith became central to that process. Alfred E. Smith's role also carried the weight of proximity to the world the fire had exposed. He was part of the political response that understood the disaster not as an isolated misfortune, but as a challenge to the state's responsibility for industrial life. Robert F. Wagner likewise became a key figure in transforming inquiry into public policy. In the Commission's work, both men stood at the point where investigation met lawmaking, where the facts of factory danger could be translated into enforceable rules. Abram Elkis belonged to this same reform response. His presence in the story helps show that the aftermath of Triangle was not shaped by one kind of actor alone. It required legislators, legal minds, investigators, reformers, labor advocates, and public officials. The movement from disaster to regulation depended on people who could gather evidence, understand statutes, question the practices of industry, and make the case that the state had both the authority and the obligation to act. The Commission's creation also changed the meaning of the Triangle Fire in public life. Before the fire, reform networks had already existed. Garment workers had struck. Organizations had fought for better conditions, and figures such as Clara Lemlich, Rose Schneiderman, Pauline Newman, and Frances Perkins had belonged to the broader world of labor reform. The fire did not invent concern for workers, but it altered the scale on which that concern could be heard. It made the hazards of industrial work undeniable to people who had not stood inside the shops. The Commission then gave that recognition a structure. It did not rely only on memory, grief, or accusation. It asked the state to see, to record, and to compare. A burned factory on Washington Place became the starting point for examining factories elsewhere. A disaster that lasted about half an hour became the basis for an inquiry into conditions that had developed over years. This is one of the quiet turning points in the Triangle story. The immediate images of the fire are vivid. The upper floors, the failed escape, the ladders that could not reach, the crowd below, the 146 dead. The Commission's work was less visible, more procedural, and far less dramatic. Yet it was through such procedure that reform could survive the fading of headlines. Investigation made memory practical. It also reframed accountability. The trial had asked whether Harris and Blanck could be convicted under existing criminal law. The Commission asked what existing law had failed to prevent. That difference mattered. A verdict looks backward at a defined act. Regulation looks forward toward repeated risk. The Commission's subject was not only what happened at Triangle, but what could happen again if nothing changed. By studying fire hazards, sanitary conditions, occupational disease, factory inspection, tenement manufacturing, and related issues, the state began to map the terrain of industrial danger. The result was not simply a report on one tragedy. It was a foundation for a new kind of labor policy in New York, one grounded in investigation and aimed at prevention. The Triangle Fire had forced the question. The Factory Investigating Commission gave the state a way to answer it. And once the evidence had been gathered, the next test would be whether findings could become law, whether recommendations about registration, sprinklers, fire safety, health, and inspection could move from paper into the working lives of the people they were meant to protect. The evidence had been gathered, but evidence alone did not change the floor of a factory, unlock a door, widen an exit, install a sprinkler, or strengthen an inspection system. The work of the Factory Investigating Commission mattered because it created a bridge between public outrage and public authority. It took testimony, inspections, and technical findings and pressed them toward the place where reform either survived or disappeared, the law. That was the decisive step after Triangle. New York did not simply mourn and move on. It began to write the lessons of the fire into rules that employers could be required to follow. The shift was quiet compared with the flames on Washington Place, and less visible than the funeral crowds that had filled the streets. But it was the shift that made the disaster an American turning point. The question was no longer only what had happened inside the Triangle Waste Company. The question was what the state would require in factories where workers still stood at machines among cloth, paper, lint, thread, dust, and scraps, in rooms where danger could accumulate as part of ordinary production. The New York State Archives describes the practical result of the Commission's early work. Several bills recommended by the Factory Investigating Commission passed in 1912. Those measures included laws concerning factory registration, automatic sprinklers, and other fire safety and health regulations. The words may sound administrative, but each one answered a failure that the Triangle Fire had made impossible to ignore. Factory registration meant that the state needed to know where factories were, who operated them, and what kind of workplaces existed behind the walls of commercial buildings. In a city filled with workshops, lofts, and manufacturing rooms, this was not a minor matter. Regulation begins with visibility. A workplace that is unknown to inspectors or poorly documented by the state is harder to supervise. By requiring registration, New York was moving toward a system in which factories could be identified, classified, visited, and held within a public framework of responsibility. Automatic sprinklers spoke even more directly to the nature of the Triangle disaster. The fire had moved with terrifying speed through the materials of garment production. The fuel was not exotic. It was the daily substance of the shop: cotton fabric, paper waste, fabric scraps, lint, thread, and dust. In such a setting, fire prevention could not depend only on someone noticing smoke, finding water, and acting in time. The Commission's recommendations helped push New York toward measures that assumed fire might begin and that buildings needed systems ready before panic started. Automatic sprinklers represented a different idea of safety, not rescue after disaster, but built-in protection before a small flame became a catastrophe. The other fire safety and health regulations recommended by the Commission belonged to the same larger transformation. Triangle had shown that danger was not confined to one dramatic point of failure. It was not only a locked door, though locked exits mattered. It was not only a collapsed fire escape, though that collapse mattered. It was not only short ladders, though the upper floors had been beyond the reach of rescue. The disaster had revealed a chain of risks: crowded workrooms, combustible materials, inadequate escape routes, weak enforcement, and a system in which the health and safety of workers had too often been treated as secondary to the pace and control of production. The Factory Investigating Commission turned that chain into a legislative agenda. It had studied fire hazards, sanitary conditions, occupational disease, factory inspection, tenement manufacturing, and related workplace issues. Its work made clear that labor law could not be limited to wages and hours alone. The conditions of the workplace itself had to be treated as a matter of public concern. Air, exits, stairs, doors, fireproofing, sanitation, disease, and inspection were not private details inside private businesses. They were part of the public cost of industrial life. The United States Department of Labor emphasizes the role of Robert F. Wagner and Alfred E. Smith in this process. They were crucial figures in the Factory Investigating Commission and in turning recommendations into law. That distinction matters. Reform history often remembers the tragedy, the testimony, and the moral clarity of public outrage. But outrage still needed legislators who could carry proposals through the machinery of government. Wagner and Smith helped translate the Commission's findings into statutes, and in doing so, they gave political form to the demands that had filled the city after the fire. Their role also shows why Triangle's legacy was not automatic. A disaster can reveal a problem without solving it. A report can describe danger without removing it. A commission can gather evidence that never becomes enforceable law. In New York after Triangle, the chain held. Grief became pressure. Pressure produced investigation. Investigation produced recommendations, and political leadership helped turn those recommendations into legal requirements. That sequence is one reason Cornell describes the fire as a pivotal event that transformed New York State's labor code. The word transformed is important. The response was not a single symbolic law or a narrow correction written only for one factory. The reform effort reshaped the state's approach to industrial labor. It helped create a more active model of government responsibility for workplace safety, one in which the state did not merely respond after death, but tried to prevent death through inspection, standards, and enforceable rules. Cornell also notes that the fire safety measures that followed served as a national model. That does not mean every workplace in America became safe or that every hazard disappeared. It means that New York's response offered a pattern other states could look to: investigate conditions, identify risks, write standards, strengthen inspection, and recognize that worker safety was not simply a matter of individual caution. In a modern industrial city, safety had to be organized. This was a profound change in the meaning of responsibility. Before Triangle, many hazards of garment work could be treated as unfortunate features of production: crowded rooms, long tables, piles of cloth, scraps underfoot, narrow passageways, doors controlled by management, and rescue systems that looked adequate only until tested. After Triangle, those conditions became evidence. They became the basis for public rules. The state's intervention said that the arrangement of a workplace could be judged before it killed people. The new laws also changed the moral geography of the factory. The upper floors of the Asch Building had once seemed like interior spaces, controlled by owners, supervisors, and the pace of the shop. The fire made those spaces visible from the street. The commission made them visible to the state. The laws made them subject to public obligation. A factory was still a place of private business, but it was no longer only that. It was also a place where the state could demand registration, fire protection, health safeguards, and inspection because the lives inside it mattered beyond the balance sheet of the firm. There is a quiet force in this part of the story because it is not built around one dramatic moment. Lawmaking is slower than fire. It moves through hearings, drafts, votes, administrative systems, and enforcement. But that slower work is where the meaning of Triangle became durable. The dead could not be restored. The courtroom had not delivered the full accountability many New Yorkers wanted. But the Commission's recommendations and the laws that followed changed the conditions under which other workers would enter other factories. That is why the legacy of Triangle cannot be measured only by the half hour of the fire or by the verdict in the trial of Isaac Harris and Max Blanck. It must also be measured by the statutes passed in 1912, by the rise of factory registration, by the push for automatic sprinklers, by the broader fire safety and health regulations, and by the labor code New York began to build from the ruins of one burned workplace. The disaster had exposed the human cost of a system that relied on speed, density, and weak safeguards. The Commission supplied the state with facts. Wagner, Smith, and other reformers helped carry those facts into law. Cornell's assessment places the result in its wider frame. The Triangle Fire transformed New York State's labor code and helped create fire safety measures that became a national model. Yet even law was not the end of the story. The reforms gave the fire a public legacy, but memory gave it a continuing presence. For some witnesses, the flames on Washington Place did not recede into history. They became a lifelong measure of what government owed to working people. Among them was Francis Perkins, who saw the disaster and later carried its lessons into the highest levels of labor policy. The movement from evidence to law had changed New York. The memory of why those laws were needed would carry the story further. The movement from evidence to law had changed New York, but the memory of why those laws were needed did not remain inside statute books. It stayed in voices, in annual commemorations, in labor history, and in the lives of people who had seen Washington Place on that Saturday afternoon and understood that the fire had revealed more than a single dangerous shop. It had revealed a failure of responsibility. For Frances Perkins, that memory was not abstract. She witnessed the Triangle Fire. The flames, the smoke, the impossible height of the upper floors, and the people trapped beyond ordinary rescue became part of the moral landscape of her public life. Perkins had already been connected to reform circles before the disaster, but Triangle gave the question of industrial safety a terrible clarity. What did government owe to workers whose labor powered a modern city? What did inspection mean if exits could still be locked or blocked? What was the value of a law if it could not reach the workroom before the alarm bell rang? The answer, for Perkins and for many reformers of her generation, was that labor policy could not be left to sympathy after disaster. It had to be built into the ordinary machinery of government. The lesson of Triangle was not simply that suffering could move people. It was that suffering had to be translated into investigation, administration, enforcement, and law. Without that translation, grief could pass, headlines could fade, and dangerous conditions could remain. Perkins would later become New York State Industrial Commissioner. In that role, the questions raised by Triangle were no longer only matters of witness and conscience. They were matters of public authority. Industrial work had to be inspected. Hazards had to be identified. Rules had to be written with the real conditions of factories in mind: crowded rooms, flammable materials, doors, stairs, fire escapes, machinery, hours, and the pressure of production. The state could not claim ignorance after Triangle. The evidence had been made visible in the most public way imaginable. Then, in 1933, Frances Perkins became United States Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman to serve in a federal cabinet position. That appointment carried the memory of Triangle into national history. It did not mean that one fire alone created a new federal labor policy, or that the path from Washington Place to Washington, D.C. was simple or automatic. But it did mean that a witness to the disaster became one of the most important labor officials in the country. The fire that had exposed the vulnerability of immigrant garment workers in a New York factory remained connected to the larger question of how a democratic government should protect working people. That long arc matters because turning points are often misunderstood. A catastrophe can appear, in hindsight, as if it naturally produced reform. But nothing about the Triangle Fire guaranteed change. The deaths of 146 workers did not, by themselves, write a new labor code. The acquittal of Isaac Harris and Max Blanck showed the limits of criminal prosecution. Public outrage could have dispersed. The shock could have become a memorial without becoming a mandate. What made Triangle different was convergence. Evidence existed because investigators, witnesses, journalists, labor organizers, and reformers forced attention onto the details. Outrage mattered because the fire was seen and mourned as a public event, not hidden as a private workplace loss. Organizing mattered because garment workers and their allies had already built networks through the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Women's Trade Union League, and the struggles that preceded the disaster. Investigation mattered because the New York State Factory Investigating Commission turned grief into hearings, inspections, testimony, and technical findings. Law mattered because figures such as Robert F. Wagner and Alfred E. Smith helped carry recommendations into enforceable public policy. The fire changed American labor not because tragedy automatically produces reform, but because people made the disaster politically and legally meaningful. They named the failures. They studied the conditions. They argued that the safety of workers was not a private favor granted by employers, but a public concern. That meaning is still tied to a specific place. The former Asch Building still stands at 23 to 29 Washington Place, just east of Washington Square Park. It is now known as the Brown Building, part of New York University. The building's survival creates a quiet tension. The walls remain. The floors remain. The city has changed around it, but the address continues to hold the memory of the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors where the Triangle Waste Company operated. In this building, the building is now formally recognized for that history. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places and designated a National Historic Landmark on July 17, 1991. It was designated a New York City landmark on March 25, 2003. These designations do not undo what happened there. They do something more modest and more lasting. They mark the site as part of the nation's public memory. They say that the history of American labor is not only found in legislatures, courtrooms, union halls, or government offices. It is also found in buildings where ordinary work was done under dangerous conditions and where those conditions became impossible to ignore. For many years, remembrance at the site depended on plaques, ceremonies, scholarship, and the continued work of descendants, labor historians, and advocates. Then, in October 2023, a permanent memorial was dedicated at the former factory site. Its steel ribbon names the victims. The choice to name them matters. The number 146 is necessary, but a number can flatten lives into scale. Names resist that flattening. They return individuality to workers too often described only by their deaths, their youth, their immigrant communities, or their place in a labor force. The memorial also fixes memory at street level, where witnesses once looked upward and saw the limits of rescue. It asks passers-by to understand that the building is not only an academic structure or an architectural survivor. It is a place where industrial modernity failed the people who made it possible. The shirtwaists produced there belonged to a changing world of ready-to-wear clothing, women's work, urban commerce, and mass production. But the fire revealed the hidden cost of that world, when speed, profit, weak enforcement, and unsafe design were allowed to define the workplace. Standing at the Brown Building, the story becomes both distant and immediate. More than a century separates the present from March 25, 1911. The garment industry has changed. Labor law has changed. Fire codes, inspections, sprinklers, exits, and public expectations have changed. Yet the questions raised by Triangle remain recognizable. Who is responsible for safety before disaster happens? How much evidence is required before government acts? Whose testimony is believed? Which workers are visible to the public and which remain unseen until something goes wrong? The Triangle Fire endures because it joins those questions to a place, a date, and a human toll that cannot be made abstract. It began in a factory filled with the ordinary materials of production: cotton fabric, paper waste, scraps, lint, thread, and dust. It moved through workrooms shaped by tables, machines, doors, stairs, and crowded routes of escape. It exposed the limits of a fire escape, the reach of ladders, the consequences of locked and blocked exits, and the inadequacy of a system that reacted too late. But its legacy was not only in what failed. Its legacy was in what followed. Mourning that became pressure, pressure that became investigation, investigation that became law, and memory that continued to shape the meaning of public responsibility. Francis Perkins carried that memory into state and national labor policy. The Brown Building carries it in stone, brick, and landmark status. The memorial carries it in steel and in names. That is why the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire stands as an American turning point. Not because one disaster purified the system by itself, not because grief alone was enough, but because, at one burned workplace in Greenwich Village, the evidence was undeniable, the outrage was public, the organizing was already alive, the investigation became systematic, and the law began to move. The factory fire ended in about half an hour. Its consequences have lasted far longer in the continuing belief that work should not require surrendering one's safety at the door.